Story 1, submitted by Daniel H. from Crows Pass, Oregon. I was 17 in the fall of 1976, old enough to drive the logging roads and young enough to think the mountains were a challenge instead of a warning. Crows Pass wasn't a real town so much as a bend in the highway with a diner, a closed ranger station, and a scatter of houses nailed to the hillside. My parents ran the diner, and when business slowed after dark, I'd slip out back and walk the trail that climbed behind it. The trail wasn't official. It was a cut-through the loggers used before the company pulled out. Halfway up, the ground dropped away into a ravine so steep you couldn't see the bottom. Just black fir tops and fog that never seemed to move. No one walked that part at night. There was no shoulder, no railing, nothing but loose gravel and roots slick with moss. Except that's where the footsteps came from. The first time, I thought it was my dad. I was closing up, dumping mop water behind the diner, when I heard boots crunching above me. Heavy steps, steady, like someone climbing with purpose. I called out his name. The steps didn't stop or speed up. They just kept time with my heartbeat, rising toward the narrowest part of the trail. I leaned out past the back door and shined my flashlight. The beam caught nothing but wet bark and drifting mist. The steps continued, now so close I could hear gravel skittering into the ravine. Whoever it was should have fallen. No one could walk there in the dark without slipping. I stood frozen until the sound reached the bend above me and simply passed. The steps went by like someone invisible brushing the air. Then they faded into the trees, uphill, where the trail ended in a rock face. I didn't tell anyone that night. Crows Pass had a way of shrinking things when you spoke them aloud. By morning, it would have sounded like a kid spooked by shadows. But the next evening, while my mom counted the register, a trucker asked if we'd heard it too. He was middle-aged, with a beard full of road dust and hands that shook when he poured his coffee. He said he'd pulled over to sleep by the old ranger station and woken to footsteps circling his cab. Slow, careful, he yelled, but no one answered. When he finally jumped down, there were no tracks, just disturbed gravel right up to the edge of the ravine. My mom laughed it off, but she locked the back door early that night. The steps came again the following week, louder, closer. Sometimes they'd start at the bottom of the ravine, where there was no path at all, and climb straight up the rock face like gravity was optional. Other times they'd begin behind the diner and head uphill, always alone, always steady, never running, never stopping. A few of us kids dared each other to listen. We'd sit on the hood of my friend Mark's car, passing a flashlight back and forth, waiting. When the steps came, Mark went pale. He swore he could hear breathing mixed in, a wet pull through teeth. I didn't hear breathing. What I heard was balance. Every footfall landed where it shouldn't, like whoever it was knew the mountain better than we did. In October, the sheriff came by. Someone had reported the noise, said it had followed them home. The sheriff hiked the trail in daylight and found nothing. No tracks. No signs of animals. He told us the mountain settles at night, rocks shifting. We nodded and pretended that explained the rhythm of 2 feet, heel then toe. The night it changed, my dad asked me to take the trash out back after closing. Fog rolled in thick enough to taste. As I lifted the bin, the steps started behind me, right on the gravel lot. Close enough that I could hear weight transfer, a slight pause between strides. I spun around, flashlight shaking. The beam lit the fog in a flat white wall. The steps didn't move away. They circled me, slow, deliberate, never crossing the light. I backed toward the door, heart hammering, and that's when a second set joined in. These were lighter, faster, child-sized. They came from the trail. I screamed and slammed inside, bolting the door. My parents rushed in, and all 3 of us stood there listening as the footsteps gathered outside. 2, maybe 3 sets, pacing the building, climbing the hill behind it, descending into the ravine where no one could walk. Then, from right outside the back wall, something scraped, like a boot toe testing wood. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. We closed the diner for a week. When we reopened, the trail behind us had collapsed. A section of ground had given way, spilling dirt and roots into the ravine. The sheriff said it was erosion, long overdue. No more path, no more place to walk. But on still nights, when the fog settles just right, I can hear them again. Footsteps climbing where the earth is gone. keeping their balance over nothing at all, heading for a place they remember even though it isn't there anymore. Story 2, submitted by Lorraine M. from Wasco County, Oregon. Crow's Pass wasn't where I grew up. It was where I ended up after my divorce because rent was cheap and nobody asked questions. I rented a narrow house on stilts just off the old service road, close enough to the ravine that fog crept under the door every morning like it was curious. The house leaned. You could feel it when you walked, a subtle pull toward the downhill wall. The landlord said it had been that way since the 70s and hadn't fallen yet. I believed him because I needed to. My bedroom window faced the slope. At night, when traffic died and the forest settled, I'd hear sounds drifting up from below. Wind in the firs, rocks ticking as they cooled, and sometimes footsteps. They weren't random. That's what bothered me. They followed a line, pacing up the incline at a steady angle, the way a person would climb if there were still a trail there. But there wasn't. The ground dropped off sharply just past my foundation. I'd checked in daylight, gripping saplings so I wouldn't slide. The first night I heard them clearly, I was half asleep. I thought it was a dream until the rhythm continued. Step, step, pause, then again. I sat up and listened, counting. Always the same distance between steps. Always moving upward. I opened the window and leaned out, the cold air shocking me awake. The sound came closer, directly below my room. I expected to hear gravel or snapping twigs, something to prove it was real. Instead, it sounded muted, like footsteps on packed earth that no longer existed. I told myself it was someone hiking illegally, a hunter maybe. But no flashlight ever cut the dark, no cough, no voice, no stumble, just the careful sound of progress. After a few nights, I noticed something else. The steps never reached the top. They climbed until they were almost level with my window, then stopped. Not faded, stopped. As if whoever it was stood right there, balanced on the empty air beside my house. I'd hold my breath, waiting for the scrape of a boot against the siding. It never came. After a long minute, the steps would resume, turning, descending back into the ravine along the same impossible line. I asked the woman at the post office about it. She stiffened when I mentioned the slope and said the ground there used to be a switchback trail before a slide took it out. A couple of people fell back then. One was a kid. She changed the subject and handed me my mail. The footsteps grew more frequent as winter came. Sometimes there were two sets, one heavier than the other, never quite in sync. On nights when rain soaked the hillside, they still came, unchanged by mud or slick rock. That's when I stopped sleeping in my bedroom. One night, close to Christmas, the power went out. The house creaked louder than usual, wood adjusting to cold. I sat in the living room with a candle and listened as the steps began early, before full dark. They climbed faster this time, urgent. When they reached the level of the house, something brushed the underside of the floor. Not a strike, a test. The candle flame wavered as weight shifted just beyond the wall. Then I heard it, fingertips, feeling along the beams, searching for purchase. I grabbed my coat and ran to my car, slipping on the porch steps. As I fumbled with the keys, the footsteps multiplied, moving all around the house now, up and down, like they were learning new paths. I didn't go back inside. I drove until the road flattened and the trees thinned, until Crow's Pass was just a bend behind me. The landlord called weeks later. He said the house had finally gone, slid clean into the ravine after a night of heavy rain. No damage to anything else, just gone. Sometimes in the city, when I walk home late and hear someone climbing stairs behind me, matching my pace exactly, I have to stop and let them pass. Because I know better than to stand where they remember the ground being. Story 3, submitted by Thomas R. from Hood River, Oregon. I was a volunteer EMT back then, mostly car wrecks and heart trouble, nothing that prepared me for Crow's Pass at night. In '76, the county radio still crackled like it was underwater, and calls came in half-formed. When dispatch said possible injury near the old trail, my partner Eddie sighed and grabbed the flashlight with the dented lens. The trail wasn't on any map we carried. It was a memory more than a place, a cut in the hillside everyone knew not to use anymore. We parked by the closed ranger station and followed the sound. Footsteps. They were coming from above us, slow and deliberate, moving downhill toward the ravine. That alone didn't make sense. You didn't walk down that slope unless you wanted to fall. Eddie called out, voice loud, professional. "County EMT, you need help?" The steps paused, then resumed. Same rhythm, same spacing, like the question hadn't registered. We climbed toward the sound, our boots sliding, gravel giving way underfoot. The fog was thick enough to blur the beam of my flashlight into a dull cone. I remember thinking how quiet everything else was. No insects, no wind. Just our breathing and those steps, always just ahead. Then we saw him. Or I did. Eddie says he never saw anything, and maybe that's worse. The beam caught the outline of legs first, standing where the trail used to narrow. They were planted at an impossible angle, feet flat on nothing. The rest of him was wrong in a way I still can't explain, like someone drawn from memory instead of life. His jacket hung too still. His head was bowed, but when he lifted it, his face didn't reflect the light. I froze. Eddie bumped into me and swore, asking what I was doing. When I looked again, there was nothing there. But the footsteps were closer now, right beside us. They circled, one set heavy, another lighter, pacing the same route over and over. Eddie's confidence drained fast. He kept sweeping his flashlight wildly, breathing hard. I tried to ground myself in procedure, in rules. "Maybe multiple hikers," I said, even as I knew there were no prints, no displaced stones. The radio on my belt crackled to life without being keyed. Static, then a sound like someone walking across gravel, amplified and distorted. Eddie ripped it off and threw it downslope. It vanished into the fog without a sound. We decided to retreat. Pride be damned. As we turned, the steps rushed us, not running, just closing distance faster than should have been possible. Something brushed my arm, cold and solid enough to make me stumble. I fell to one knee, hand scraping rock, and for a second I was lower than the trail, looking up. That's when I understood. They weren't walking on the mountain. They were walking on the way it used to be. The steps passed over us, climbing higher, toward the rock face where the trail had ended decades before. As they went, the pressure lifted, the air warming again. Eddie hauled me up, and we ran without speaking until we hit the road. We filed no report. What would we have written? Responded to sounds. Eddie quit volunteering that winter. I stayed on, but I never answered another call near Crow's Pass after dark. Years later, I still hear that radio sometimes, crackling on my nightstand, replaying the sound of careful footsteps where no one can walk anymore. Story 4, submitted by Elaine P. from the Dalles, Oregon. I was 8 when my brother vanished at Crow's Pass, and for years everyone pretended that meant he was dead. It was easier that way, a clean ending. A cross nailed to a tree near the old trailhead. People brought casseroles and lowered their voices around my parents, but nobody ever said they found him. It was August of 1976. Hot, dry, the kind of summer where the hills smelled like dust and pine sap. My brother Michael was 16 and restless. He'd grown up hearing about the trail that used to cut along the ravine and how it was gone now, like a dare no one could prove wrong. The night he disappeared, he told me he was going to listen. That's what he called it, listening. He said if you stood still near the pass after dark, you could hear footsteps climbing the mountain. He swore they weren't animals. He swore they sounded like people who knew exactly where to put their feet. I begged him not to go. He laughed and promised he'd be back before I fell asleep. I never saw him again. The search lasted a week. Deputies, volunteers, dogs. They found nothing. No torn clothes, no blood. Just disturbed gravel near the ravine, like someone had paced there for a long time. The official story was that he slipped and fell, carried away by the slope. At night I lay in bed and listened. Our house was miles away, but when the wind shifted just right, I could hear it too. Step, step, pause. A sound so careful it hurt to listen to. Years passed. I grew up, moved away, tried to forget the exact rhythm of my brother's walk. I came back to Crow's Pass after my parents died just to settle things. The diner was gone. The ranger station was a shell. The trail was nothing but scarred earth and brush. I told myself the footsteps were a story people told to fill the quiet. That night, staying in my car near the old road, I heard them. They started low in the ravine. One set, then another, lighter, uneven, like someone favoring one leg. They climbed together, slow and steady, retracing a path burned into the mountain itself. I got out of the car without thinking. The fog wrapped around me, thick and cold. The steps drew closer, and with them came something else, a sense of recognition, like a tune you haven't heard in decades. "Michael?" I whispered. The lighter steps stopped. The heavier ones continued, passing between us, brushing the air. I felt a pressure in my chest, grief tightening like a fist. Then, from just uphill, the lighter steps resumed, hesitant now, unsure. I understood then. Some of them remembered how to walk the trail. Some of them were still learning. The footsteps reached the place where the trail used to narrow, right where my brother would have stood if he'd been listening that night. They paused there, balancing on nothing, waiting. I stayed until dawn, until the fog thinned and the mountain looked ordinary again. When I left, the steps followed me for a while, keeping their distance, stopping when I did. They never caught up, but I know my brother is still there, walking away the earth no longer allows, careful not to fall, because he's had all these years to practice.